Welcome to Vox Rationis with me, Aditya Kashyap, and
Karthik.
this is a podcast where we talk world issues from a student's perspective. So, as you guys may have noticed on our last episode, we're entering into a new phase of the podcast where we're now recording live with our videos and with our cameras on. So, you guys can all see us now. So, it'll be much more interactive, and I'm sure you guys have a lot more positive feedback for us in the future as well. And we received a lot of positive feedback on our last episode that detailed on affirmative action, which is, of course, is an issue which has been raging on for decades, but especially in the light of the Supreme Court decision, we thought that we'd sort of give our perspectives on it as students who are, following the U.S. news, and I'm applying to the U.S., as well as those who are. We want to look at the perspectives of other countries. How do their affirmative action rulings work and stuff? And I think it was a really enlightening experience to do so. But today, we have a very special episode of the podcast because we have a guest, a most distinguished guest, might I add. That is Madhav Menon. So, would you like to introduce yourself, Madhav?
Yeah, sure, Aditya and Trish. Thanks for having me. My name is Madhav Menon. I'm 18 years old and I'm currently in the 12th grade. I've been doing like MUNs and stuff for a really long time, so I'm really invested into the MUN sphere, if you will. I believe that's what we're going to talk about today. But just outside of MUNs, I really like physics and math. In fact, I planning on studying physics at university. I have my own physics blog which I hope Aditya and Trish will plug into this. And I also do a bunch of other stuff. I co-founded the STEM club in my school with some of my friends. I also did the MUN club in my school. So we basically train students to kind of do better at conferences, and we kind of encourage them to do conferences as well. So like recently, I was at APL MUN with Aditya, so we trained a bunch of students from our school to go there and basically just have fun, learn what MUN is, and engage with politics. So yeah, I guess that's a bit about me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madhav. And as mentioned before, Madhav was at our MUN at APL, and he was a most wonderful vice chair, may I add, deeply inspired by his knowledge of the crisis, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's a most spectacular topic to talk about, even as a general topic. But of course, today our episode is on MUNs, on UNs, and about the UNSC specifically. So I hope we're going to have a great time talking to you, Madhav, and see you around.
So now we move on to like the bulk of our discussion today. So Aditya, is there anything which you'd like to ask Madhav?
Yeah, so as Madhav mentioned before, he's quite an experienced moner. I'm more interested, and this is kind of the topic of our podcast, as to how doing MUNs has really shaped the way he thinks and perceives politics, as well as general discussions. Because I've personally heard great things about MUNs from my own personal experience, as well as other people I've seen. They seem to pose their arguments a lot better. And I certainly saw that when Madhav was our vice chair, he was very poised, and I think it was very inspiring to see. So Madhav, given that you've done MUNs for so long, how has it impacted you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I started MUNs really young, so I was in the fifth grade, and I think that was a bit too young for me because I wasn't fully developed in the sense that I wasn't fully receptive about the world that was happening, what was happening in the world around me. But I think nevertheless, as you grow older and you start actually understanding the intricacies of like geopolitical security and like how countries actually work together and all of that, you start becoming more receptive. Obviously, you have the basic skills that MUN teaches you, how to research, how to speak, how to put your points forward, how to be assertive or aggressive in a more diplomatic way. But I think there are certain nuances as well. For example, one big thing that MUNs teach you about is about this thing called foreign policy, where basically countries have like this set of rules that they follow, if you will, which kind of governs their interactions with other countries or the trade relations they might have, or what they might do in certain situations. And I think once you do a MUN, you really start understanding the foreign policy of a country. And as a result, you start understanding the decisions that they make. So, for example, if you're reading the newspaper and you realize that, oh, a certain country has, stopped exporting something, or another country has declared war on another country or whatever. I think after doing MUNs, you can start becoming more critical of that because you start understanding a country's foreign policy more. And I think that's very important. You understand the way a country works, and I think the way you do that is by starting to understand how foreign policy works.
Yeah, that was quite comprehensive, Madhav. And I think the point about learning about foreign policy is it's a great point, because if I were to speak about my last month where Madhav was our vice chair, I was allotted the country of Pakistan, and I was mourning to Trisha about it for so long. But in the end, it was actually quite gratifying because despite living in India and having this perceived view about Pakistan, you kind of like have to put yourself in the shoes of the country, and I think that's a really great thing. That it's almost like you're doing method acting to some extent. I would say, yeah. And Trish, you've done a few months, haven't you? What's your thoughts on how has it shaped you?
I mean, yeah. So in the months which I did, I was really scared at first, and I was really scared of talking. I didn't want to talk as much. So I was kind of like, as Mother said, it does help me do some research and find out like what the country's foreign policy is and how it stands. And it also did help me understand because I was studying economics simultaneously. So I wanted to see that, okay, does it actually work out, and is it in the best interest of the country from the economic perspective as well as other perspectives. So uh, that surely was really interesting for me, and yeah, it does help me relate to like a lot of what Mother has said.
In fact, I just like to add on to what Aditya said. I think my first MUN teacher, or well, like the person that ran the MUN club, which was back in fifth grade, they told me that you should never be the delegate of your own country because biases start playing in. Like Aditya rightly mentioned, you have perceived views about other countries. You already have perceived ideas of what your country should do. And if you want to sort of break that and be more open-minded, you can only do it by representing another country, by actually, if you don't know something about a country, you start researching, and that way you start becoming more open-minded, you start becoming more receptive about their culture, about their traditions, you start understanding the way that specific country works with. And if you don't have a biased viewpoint about it, it's a lot better. So yeah, I think MUNs really help you break those perceived notions or those perceived stereotypes that you might have of other countries.
Great point. Great point. So
So
Trish, a question?
yeah, so Madhav, you've been as you said, from grade five, you've been doing months. So like, what do you really like about them that made you do it for so long?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, like I said, I started off MUNs really young, so I didn't really understand the benefits of MUN until probably about eighth or ninth grade, which is when COVID struck. So there were all these online conferences that were happening, and with more free time, I guess you could do more MUNs. So I didn't really see the benefits of doing MUNs until about 3 or 4 years into actually having done MUNs, right? And I think one of the biggest benefits is that you just meet people from different schools, right? I've made a lot of friends just through MUNs, and hearing their perspectives, hearing their views and the way they approach certain problems or whatever is really refreshing because you start learning more just from different perspectives. And I think the other thing I really like about MUNs is it's just a different platform. I personally like debating a lot as well. I've done like a bunch of the ISDS selection camps or whatever. And I think debating can be really aggressive and really competitive, and sometimes it can get pretty toxic as well. Which is why I think MUNs are just a more laid back version of that. It's a forum where you can debate, but at the same time, you can just have fun, right? And most importantly, you just learn how to be diplomatic, and you learn how to how to deal with things that really annoy you. I've done so many MUNs where just like other delegates have really annoyed me, and is you get so angry sometimes, but you just have to deal with it, and you have to be really diplomatic about it. And I think that's really important because if you go out and work in a job, you're not going to have colleagues that are very nice, right? You're going to have to deal with some really difficult colleagues. So I think that's just one thing. You learn how to deal with difficult people. And I think that's just one thing I like about monks. Sometimes it can frustrate you so much, but coming out of it, you learn so much about other people. You learn so much about the issue as well. In 2022, I did a DISEC month. So DISEC is another branch of the UN, which deals with disarmament. So it's kind of like the UNSC, but it doesn't specifically focus on some of the topics that the UNSC would. And this one was about biological and chemical warfare. And I was delegate of Turkey, right? So obviously, I would have done some research about Turkey's foreign policy and stuff. But coming out of that month, I learned some things about Turkey's foreign policy just from other delegates who weren't representing Turkey. So I think you can learn a lot just from other people. And I think that's one thing I like about MUNs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Madhav. And like I mentioned before, I think I myself and probably Trish as well, didn't we didn't really appreciate months, or at least I didn't appreciate months as much as until I did the last one. It had been a really long time since I'd done a month, and the funny thing was that like I didn't when I used to do months, I actually didn't really like I mentioned, I didn't really recognize the value for it. I think most people just did it for the sake of it, herd mentality and all those things. But I actually think that like when I did my last one, I was actually, since I'd already, gained a lot of knowledge about foreign policy and politics, I think it gave me a more sagacious view about the topic. And I was also a lot more like calm as well when I heard some of the debates, and I felt like I was more inclined to kind of like be in the conversation a lot more, because I remember in my first month I was just sitting there silent. I was just hearing what other people were doing, and I was too scared to raise any points. But I
Yeah.
think once you kind of like get a feel for what you're actually talking about, what you're doing, then you really start to want to do more months and get into the month sphere, which as a word which I really like. So Trish,
Yeah, I mean, I initially the first few months I did, I was really quiet. I didn't want to. I like was like silent. I was doing the chits passing. I was trying to. I did have a lot of biases as well. So certain countries, certain delegates, I was just asking, "What is this? Your country's foreign policy? This is not a proper violation." And I could get, I guess, be a little more open through the chits compared to like blasting a country straight up. And yeah, so but then later on, I did realize the value of it because I did a course from the UN, which was like the Young Researchers Program, which it did kind of did open my view to like international diplomacy, and it's not just like it did kind of give me like a goal to work towards, and months was like a really great experience to go towards that, attaining that goal. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. So thanks for that, Trish. And now I want to ask Madhav a question about a particular committee at the MUN, as well as in the UN itself. It's a real committee. Most of the committees that exist in UNs are based on their real life counterparts. And of course, that's about the UNSC, which is the committee which Madhav was my vice chair at APL MUN. And I wanted to talk about this one because I feel like it's probably the one which gets the most traction, as well as being the probably the most one which gets put into a lot of these debates as well. Because as most people might know, the UNSC has this very weird quirk where they only have 5 permanent members in it, and they all have this veto power, wherein any resolution passed against them, they can easily veto it. And I think that raises questions about accountability. So, given that there are wars ongoing right now, like for example, there's one going in Sudan, there's one going on in Niger, and of course the ongoing Ukrainian war. Do you think the UNSC is a committee which really is impactful, and do you think there are some systemic problems that need to be addressed for it? How would you respond to this, Madhav?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Just a preface, I like to start by saying if you think of the UN, there's like a 90% chance you're probably thinking of the UNSC, right? Like going into MUNs in fifth grade, I thought the UN was all about like stopping wars and all of that. And sometimes, to an extent, if you ask anyone what the UN is, they'd probably have the same answer, right? So I think the UNSC is kind of like the face of the UN, sort of, which is why it gains a lot of traction. And I think you brought up some really good points about accountability. You're right. So the way the UNSC works is you have permanent members and non-permanent members. So you've got like five permanent members, which are the US, UK, Russia, China, and then France. And they basically have veto power, which is where they can just straight up veto a resolution, and that resolution kind of fails automatically. And then you have these non-permanent members, but the thing is, the non-permanent members keep switching every couple of years. So that means if, say, India is a non-permanent member at one point in time, it's after its term ends, it's not a non-permanent member anymore until it gets re-added or whatever. So I think it really depends. There are obviously issues with the veto in and of itself. For example, gridlocks always happen. The Syrian civil war is one example of this. There was a lot of there was basically a deadlock between the different countries in the UNSC, and that obviously can lead to no action ultimately being done. I think a lot of people, there are many critics of the UN who say that it's absolutely useless and that it achieves nothing. And I think it's because of this specific deadlock, right? But at the same time, the UNSC can be effective when it's dealing with issues that aren't necessarily pertaining to the five permanent members. So, for example, if it's about a skirmish in another country, the five permanent members may have some sort of consensus, or they might have some sort of common aim they want to achieve. That specific conflict might affect all of them in a certain way. Their trade might be harmed or something. So they might have some sort of consensus, and therefore they might, reach the end sort of quicker. But obviously there are issues. The permanent members can have their own influences. The non-permanent members, again, it keeps switching. It's not really a permanent thing. And it's really hard for a non-permanent member to become a permanent member. Like India has been trying to become a permanent member for quite a while, but some countries have been saying, some of the five permanent members have been vetoing that. So again, it's a really tricky tightrope. And there are a lot of issues. Addressing them is another thing altogether, because it's not easy to bring about a change in which you have that would ultimately affect over 190 countries, right? So again, yeah, there are a lot of faults with the UNSC or with the UN in general, but then it's not really easy to try and fix them either. So
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points because for me, I found it very pertinent when I think in January, this article that I read from the Hindu, where the UN General Assembly's president, Zaba Korosi, I hope I'm saying that correct, he said the UN Security Council does not reflect today's realities, is paralyzed and unable to discharge its basic function of maintaining international peace and security when one of its permanent members has attacked its neighbor. So, of course, the president is talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think, like you mentioned before, this is where sort of people start saying that the UN is useless, the Security Council is useless, and I think, especially, I feel like when it's very pertinent when a permanent member has attacked a non-permanent member, and there's a sort of, I feel like there's sort of a lack of accountability at times when you don't when the the country is able to just veto the motion, and I feel like this has been going on for over a year. It's been going on for a year and a half, and we still haven't really reached any consensus on a peace settlement, at least in the UN. There are other attempts. Saudi Arabia is trying something right now. So I think it's really important, and I think what Madhav gives some really good points. So Tish, you have some very interesting views about the UN yourself, right? So how would you join the discussion here?
Uh, I mean, the UN was initially, when I looked at it, I heard of it as like a multilateral system where almost like every member state was on like an equal level. So because each of them had like the same amount of weightage to their votes. But in the case as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a permanent member could kind of get away with invading another country, it kind of shows that maybe it's not as much as multilateral as one may feel, and that is it does kind of change the power dynamics, because I think the predecessor to the the UN was the League of Nations was also kind of described as like a winners club where Britain, France, and to an extent Italy were like the main players in in the League of Nations. And if that falls through to the UN, I think that it may not have achieved the purpose of being like a successor to the League of Nations, but hopefully that can improve on from now. So, to Madhav, I'd like to ask another question, which was regarding a lot of countries have now started claiming that countries are interfering within their internal matter and within their affecting the domestic integrity of a nation in a way. So, how do you feel that has? How relevant do you feel that is in today's time?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's again a tightrope walk. Where anything in the UN, it's a tightrope walk. The whole point of the UN is to sort of deal with issues of global significance, right? You have human right violations in so many countries, and that violate, so many charters and so many conventions and all of that. And therefore, it is the responsibility of the UN to step up because that's its whole purpose, right? To promote, global harmony and all of that. But at the same time, when countries attempt to do so, other countries have the leverage of just saying it's an internal matter. And again, countries have no right in interfering in a country's internal matter, right? Because the other country doesn't rule that specific country. It's not aware of the population dynamics and the different demographics within that country. So again, it's honestly a tightrope walk. Countries can claim things are internal matters when in fact they might not be. And again, it's more of like a he said, she said kind of situation. And that is another fault of the UN. You'd expect action from the UN, but when you have sort of countries abusing this, you can't really do much about it, right? You just have to deal with it, or you might hope for some sort of change in the system or something like that. But again, it's just you just have to deal with it, or you hope for some sort of change. But again, that change might not come very soon because you can't just overnight bring about a huge change overnight, in an organization which involves most of the countries of the world, right? I think only two countries aren't actually part of the UN: Palestine and the Vatican City, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, again, it's you can't do anything about it. You just have to deal with it. But it is a pressing issue, absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, Madhav, I'd like to ask you one final question, and that's that and you were alluding to this as well. So if you had any changes which you felt should be made to the UN, what would those be? Given that the UN has been under so much scrutiny, over the years, not just now but over the years. What would those be? And like do you think any of these would be reasonable?
Yeah. So I'd like to again preface this by saying that the understanding of the way the UN works from an MUN perspective is kind of skewed. MUN is specifically designed for like children and teenagers. And uh, so a lot of stuff that happens in the UN is actually removed. The point of an MUN is you get the gist of what happens in the UN, and therefore it's highly theoretical. Like, for example, all three of us study economics, right? The economic theory we learn in school is extremely theoretical. Stuff like the Keynesian view of aggregate supply, or whatever externalities, none of it actually works in the real world as how they describe it in the textbook, right? So our understanding of the UN is extremely theoretical. My understanding of the UN is extremely theoretical, right? I might not know how it works actually. I only know how it works from my experience of doing MUN. But nevertheless, there are some pretty big flaws in the way the UN works. Firstly, with respect to the Security Council, you have, permanent members having the veto power, and that sort of gets you nowhere. It's not easy to abolish the veto power. The veto power has a lot of has a rich history. A lot of countries have used it. They have abused the veto power for their own benefits. Sometimes it's been used properly, but again, most of the time it's just been abused, right? So I think veto power is something. Secondly, probably the way the permanent member, non-permanent member dynamic works. Maybe you might want the UNSC to be slightly larger, but again, the whole point of the UNSC is it deals with with issues of global significance, right, that affects everybody. And so you want decisions to happen really quickly in the UN. You don't want it to be, a huge member nation body, because things are just going to be absolutely slow, right? But at the same time, if you only have five main countries controlling the way it works, they kind of have a monopoly on global security. And that's again another issue. And the third one that I can think of right now is probably the way resolutions work. So, as I understand it, only resolutions that come from the UNSC are actually binding. So that means countries have to follow it. But at the same time, resolutions don't really come from the UNSC because they have a deadlock. But at the same time, there are other committees that deal with very important issues like the Human Rights Council, and their resolutions might not be binding, right? Which means countries don't really have to follow it. So, like, what's the point of discussing something on a global stage if ultimately countries can just choose to ignore the outcome of that discussion or that conversation? So I think those are some pretty big flaws of the UN. Again, changing it is entirely wishful thinking. It's probably not going to. It might not change in our lifetime. It might not change, in the next generation or whatever. But those are just certain things that they can start with. Again, changing these could have negative impacts as well, right? For example, if you change the way binding resolutions work, you could have resolutions that are really unfair against certain countries, certain smaller countries that might not have as much of a voice or might not have as much power. We know the UN has put every single country on equal footing, but I mean, realistically, that it doesn't work like that, right? Certain countries have more voice, they have more power over certain things, and therefore you could have resolutions that are completely unfair against other countries. um and so things could be certain changes could be for the worse as well. But I mean, potentially addressing these could be a step in the right direction, right? So yeah, I think that's just potential changes you could make to the UN. Again, I'm saying this comes from my knowledge of the way UN works, from my experience in the MUN. The UN doesn't actually work the way it works in MUN. There, it is faithful for the most part, but there are obviously some pretty big differences. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's really good to add, Madhav, because I think, like you mentioned before, the smaller nations being incorporated, that's probably one thing which, especially India, we're not a small nation in any means, but that's probably one change which I think this country would like to see. And India, on its own, has been also calling for members of the global south, as well as other developing nations like Brazil, and even a developed country like Germany. Seems kind of odd that these countries aren't in the decision making of the UNSC. And we've been hearing about India's aspirations for quite a while. So I think that's certainly something which I would like to see changed. Trish, anything which you'd like to add?
Yeah. So, as I said, as I said, the smaller countries, they need to. The power dynamics has changed over the last 80 or so years, and countries which may have remained relevant, that may have been relevant, as relevant in the world spectrum in 1945, may not be as powerful in today's time. And as you said, India, Brazil, South Africa, China are all growing nations, and especially India and Brazil would want a seat in the as a permanent member in the United in the Security Council. And maybe some may question to the relevance of, let's say, Britain and maybe even France to an extent, as there are they really in any position to be a permanent member? And yeah, so that's one of the really important things we should consider.
Right. So on that note, I think I want to thank everyone for being here. Madhav, it was great to have you here on our show, on our podcast, and your views obviously very insightful, and we can learn a lot from you, especially given your way of speaking is very eloquent, and we enjoyed the way which the points which you made. So thanks for joining us. And Trish, anything which you'd like to add?
Yeah, I really like. Thank you so much, Madhav. It was your first guest on our podcast, and it was really wonderful having you here. You were like really fluent in the way you spoke. You're really knowledgeable. So I learned a lot, especially Atya learned a lot. He says. So thank you so much for being with us. Hope
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak. This is the first time I'm doing something like this. So yeah, so it's been really insightful, great conversation. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. So on that note, we hope that you guys, the viewers, enjoyed this episode of Vox Rationis. and we hope that this was as insightful for me as it was for you guys. So yeah, on that note, like and subscribe, share our podcast, and of course check out Madhav's physics blog. It's on Medium, I presume, and he's got a lot of great content there as well. So yeah, we don't want to keep Madhav waiting for too long. So thank you so much, Madhav.
Thank you so much, guys.
You guys.